And this is the Concealed Carry Podcast, Season 10, Episode 14. And welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast, part of the concealedcarry.com network, brought to you by HK. Today is Thursday, August 29th, 2024, as of the recording of this episode. And I'm your host, Riley Bowman, and joined by co-host Brian McLaughlin.
Good morning,
Doc.
good morning, or good afternoon,
morning.
I should say.
It might be morning for you.
Hey, wherever you're at in the world.
Well, I'm glad to be here with you, my friend. It's been a while since I've been on the podcast.
Glad to have you back. Jacob
Yeah,
is cool and everything, but he's no Riley Bowman, of course.
It was after a little bit of a hiatus there. Glad to be back, although I'm in a different setting than you might expect. I'm not even at home, not in our company. I'm not at the company HQ. I am in downtown Salt Lake City, Utah, here for actually unrelated to me, just here for accompanying my wife on a trip. But able to do the podcast here remotely. So we're excited to be back together. I am, let's see here. Oh, today we're going to be talking about malfunctions. You can tell I'm rusty at this. We are going to be talking about preventing and fixing gun malfunctions. So we got some really interesting content, I think, coming up in today's episode. Today's episode is sponsored and brought to you by Ready Up Gear dummy rounds, which if you want top quality, like I think truly the best quality dummy rounds that you can buy on the market for a reasonable price, like some of the less awesome dummy rounds from other manufacturers are actually still more expensive than the much better ones that Ready Up Gear makes. Check out concealedcarry.com/dummy rounds is a link where you can go check them out. We're going to be talking about those dummy rounds in today's content, and they're featured in some other upcoming future video content, which we'll talk about here as well. So check out Ready Up Gear dummy rounds at concealedcarry.com/dummy rounds, and consider picking some up. They're great for dry fire practice. They're great for live fire practice. You can do ball and dummy drills. You can mess around with your friends safely, of course, and have a good time training, clearing malfunctions using them. Speaking of malfunctions, one of the more challenging malfunctions to set up and simulate, if you will, in live fire practice, because it's something that traditionally you had to simulate by setting it up manually, and it was not realistic at all in how we used to do it. But training type 3 malfunctions, sometimes also called failure to extract malfunctions, sometimes also referred to as double feed malfunctions, you should check out the type 3 malfunction round product, also available on our website, concealedcarry.com/T3MR, to get a hold of those so you can actually practice truly in live fire those types of malfunctions. So with the dummy rounds, you could put those in your magazine and you would get, you could practice your typical tap rack clearing malfunction. But with the type 3 malfunction rounds, you can actually practice type 3 malfunctions where you got to go through the whole procedure of how to deal with that type of malfunction. We're talking about that in today's episode. So that's why those are the two things sponsoring today's episode, making it possible. We appreciate your support of our products that we mentioned. So check out concealedcarry.com/T3MR. The other thing we wanted to mention is starting next week, we're going to be bringing to you and featuring some new exciting content. We're going to be heavily focused on malfunctions, sending out a series of free videos about malfunctions, which will ultimately lead up to a huge announcement from us on September 12th. If you aren't already on our email list, please sign up right away so you can make sure to get those emails next week.
Looks like we're having some technical difficulties here.
All right, I'm back.
There we are. All right.
So make sure that you get on that email list so that next week you don't miss any of the announcements we're bringing to you, and especially so you don't miss our huge announcement on September 12th. One easy way to make sure you're on our email list is go to concealedcarry.com/newsletter. Concealedcarry.com/newsletter. All righty. So, Brian, we're here today to talk about malfunctions.
Yes,
So,
sir.
what do
So
you want, man?
I was thinking there are two types of people in the world when it comes to malfunctions, I would say. So the first type is the person that doesn't know about malfunctions, isn't well trained or hasn't been training for very long and hasn't added that as part of their training program yet. And then you've got people who are aware of malfunctions and have trained it in the past and think that they're okay, but might need some extra instruction. And that's where I would consider myself to kind of fall into that category. I've done a significant amount of training in my past where I've worked my own malfunction drills and that kind of thing. And so I tend to catch myself falling into this category of comfort where I'm like, I got it. I've trained this in the past. Is this something that I really need to focus on? And I would definitely count myself in the category of somebody who's trained this before, but I need to re-engage with this to make sure that I understand not only the philosophy behind how you're clearing these malfunctions, but make sure that I'm actually doing the techniques correctly. One of the things that I've noticed is the science of anything is dramatically improving every day as we learn new techniques. And maybe something that I learned 10 years ago on how to clear, a stovepipe stoppage, maybe that's still the way we're going to do it today, or maybe things have changed up. So I think that's kind of the opportunity that we're at here with these malfunction drills.
Yeah, I think that's wise for you to point out. Kind of some different categories of folks that might exist. As you mentioned, you've spent some time practicing, dealing with malfunctions. Today, well, and actually, before I get into that, what I wanted to add to that is I think it's important to establish and recognize what the, I guess, likelihood of malfunctions are. Uh, because some people, probably another category of folks that might exist are, well, I only use quality gear. I only carry a such and such brand gun, and I only use such and such brand ammo. And I have never experienced a malfunction with that setup before. And so I'm not concerned about malfunctions or having to deal with them in a self-defense situation. But what I could tell you is that malfunctions during a self-defense situation are relatively, I say relatively, they're fairly common, meaning that they do in fact happen. And if anything, they're more common to occur during a stressful incident
That's very
for a
interesting. I like
variety of
that.
yeah, for a variety of reasons. Um, and so, I mean, let's give you an example. Let's just use the classic, Glock pistol that has been around a long time now at this point. That has a supposed reputation for reliability. Okay, I said supposed. They're known to be a reliable operating firearm. Okay, they have a history of that. It's one of the reasons why certain agencies and folks have chosen them for duty weapons and whatnot, because they tend to work pretty well. They tend to not be super picky with respect to ammunition, at least in my experience. And so those are good things, right? And so it's like, okay, I'm going to carry a Glock pistol in the caliber of my choice, probably 9mm in today's world, which, I've got several Glock pistols myself. I've shot many, many, many thousands of rounds through them in years past. Don't shoot them as much these days because these days I'm shooting HK pistols, but my Glocks have been very reliable for me. Okay, here's what I can tell you. I can point you to a number of YouTube videos of shootings where Glocks malfunction. Occurring in officer-involved shootings is not an uncommon thing at all. There's several that I can directly point you to that involve, a reliable pistol platform, something that has a reputation for that, and in a shooting where a person needs them to work, meaning an officer that's being shot at, they have a malfunction. They experience a malfunction. Why do you think that is? Seriously, a question for you, Brian. Why do you think a gun that maybe hasn't, like in a particular officer's hands, hasn't really malfunctioned up to that point, and then suddenly they're in maybe their first ever officer involved shooting, and all of a sudden they get a malfunction? Why do you think that is?
I think it could be operator induced. It could be their lack of experience on that gun, and also being in a very stressful environment. They might not get a good purchase on that weapon, and you could get a serious stoppage from operator induced error.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head right there with that. I think a huge factor in malfunctions that occur during actual self-defense shootings are due to operator inducement. I guess you could say operator error, but essentially something happens where the operator causes that malfunction to occur. And so then beware, folks, because some of you might be like, "Well, I'm skilled enough, I practice enough, I'm not going to have an operator induced error that's going to cause a malfunction in my gun." And what I could tell you is, as a trainer, as an instructor, having taught classes all around the country to a lot of different folks from a lot of different backgrounds, of all flavors, those with extensive law enforcement experience or military experience, or even just extensive civilian firearms experience. And I have seen experienced people have malfunctions that were operator induced. And the reason why is because when we start adding stress to an individual, there's always that potential that now, hey, I mean, whether it's because you're trying to do something faster than you've ever done it before, whether you're trying to respond to a stimulus that you weren't quite expecting or you weren't quite ready for, whatever it could be, all of a sudden you're pushing yourself in a way that maybe you haven't done before very much, if ever. And now you start doing some funky things. Maybe you don't quite grip the pistol quite right. Maybe your support hand gets on there funky. Maybe one of your thumbs gets in the way of the slide. That you just never do that, but all of a sudden you do because wow, stress. So stress does funny things to people, and and by that a lot of time, and it can be performance stress. It can be actual like life threatening stress. It doesn't really matter. Like in this context, stress is stress. It causes you to respond in a way physically and do things that you don't typically do.
Well, even in the
And so,
chaos of this situation, you could maybe get a piece of clothing caught in the slide as, you fire
Mhm.
around or something, just totally out of your ability to control it. You have to get this shot off, and you're in a compromised position when you do, you could still have a stoppage there that you have to figure out how to clear.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an excellent point. You could be even entangled with somebody. I just saw a video the other day of a shop owner working in his store, and he is all of a sudden ambushed by a robber. And the nature of how that developed, like he's basically face to face with this guy, and he manages to draw his gun. Okay, but he is like, I mean, we're talking arm's length distance. Like they have hands on each other at this point. And even something like that, that's almost out of your control as far as you don't get to control in that at that distance so easily anyway what the other person does with their hands, and they could induce a malfunction, right? And so even in that context, it's also important to understand like in a normal situation, malfunction clearing is one thing, meaning if I get to use both hands, I can, some of you are like, hey, no, I have no problem, doing a tap rack or clearing a type 3 malfunction when I have both hands available. But what if you're entangled and you experience malfunction? Have you practiced or learned how to clear those same malfunctions with one hand only? That's a relevant thing as well to consider. Something else that we will talk about on the podcast. I don't know for sure if we'll get to that today or in a future episode, but we'll see where we get to today. So those are just some things to think about. So we could have entanglement with our threat. We could have clothing getting or other objects in our environment getting in the way of our gun cycling properly. I've seen such things too, where um, I've seen this in a vehicle. I've seen it through windows and ports and things on the range, but I've seen it in a vehicle too, in a vehicle class where someone's shooting through a window and because their gun was too close to the frame, the door frame or the window frame, it actually, the brass didn't fully eject from the gun because the frame kept it from coming all the way out. And all of a sudden they have a failure to eject malfunction. I've actually even seen it happen to me in a 3-gun match years ago, where I fired a round and the brass casing came out of the gun and bounced back, because like it bounced off of like a wall or something and bounced back into the action of my gun.
Like, what are the odds
So,
of that happening? It's
well,
one of those in the military, they call that Private Murphy. If it can
right.
go wrong, it will. You could be just this epic gunfighter, and just this one piece of brass just bing, just messes up your whole
I
day.
can tell you, I know that's not like a once in the world fluke sort of thing. I've heard of that happening multiple times from people over the years. So these are the kinds of things that can and do happen. Okay. And so when you're just practicing on a square range, you're like, hey, I never have these problems. I never have malfunctions. My gun, is a reliable gun. Uh, that's fine. That's a square range. That environment is different than the environment you might find yourself in for your future. Hopefully not for anybody. We don't welcome that, but for anybody. But it can happen, right? Your future gunfight. You don't get to
Well,
pick the time, the location, the circumstances of your particular fight.
let me ask you what you think about this. Like, I would assume somebody who says that they never have a malfunction, I would guess that they just don't train enough. Like, I don't I don't shoot as much competition as I used to, but when I
Mhm.
was shooting competition and when I was practicing for competition, like, I had to learn how to clear every stoppage at some point. And I was running, like, quality stuff like M&P and Glock and and things like that. Like, nothing crazy. But I would say that if you shoot enough, there's a good chance.
Yeah. So, interesting thing there. Um, I have experienced malfunctions over the years. I've shot quite a bit over the years. I've shot competitively. Most of the malfunctions I've experienced have been ammunition related, right? Where a gun just failed to go bang, or the round failed to go bang. And so, that's not necessarily a gun problem, um, but it's an ammunition problem. And that could be the problem that you're faced with too. You could be using high quality self defense ammunition, and you could get a round that fails to go pop when you need it to. So, these sorts of things can happen to anybody, anytime, anywhere. Um, I could tell you that my experience shooting the particular guns I was that time, for a good chunk of my competitive career, I shot something other than an HK. And to my understanding, I've not experienced a malfunction that was due to the gun having a problem. But yes, several malfunctions that were ammunition related. I've seen backwards primers, I've seen sideways primers, I've seen primers that were just bad. If I had inspected that round beforehand, I would have been like, that's a good round. But for some reason, it just doesn't go bang. Maybe that primer is missing the anvil, which is the important, crucial part that allows that primer to actually ignite. You got to have something that opposes that firing pin striking the primer on the inside of the primer that allows that compound to flash. And so sometimes primers are installed and the anvil's missing. It happens, and those things are difficult to catch in manufacturing. And so yes, you're absolutely right that, to sit there and say, "Oh, yeah, it's not going to happen to me," or "I don't have these sort of things happen to me." You might be doing everything correctly in terms of your firearm maintenance. You might be inspecting your ammunition before you actually use it and load your gun. I inspect my ammo, my self defense ammo. Like every round that goes in my self defense guns, I look at very carefully. I'm looking at bullet setback. Okay, is the bullet pushed back into the case where, beyond, like, well, it shouldn't be pushed in at all, but if you chamber around multiple times, can it push that bullet into the case? It can, and that can cause problems. Um, I'm inspecting that the hollow points themselves are actually not, that they're not deformed in any way, because I want them to function as they should as far as hollow points are designed to work. And I want to make sure that I'm not going to have any feeding issues as that round is pushed up the feed ramp and into the chamber of the gun. So I'm looking at the hollow point and making sure that it's in good proper order, that it looks like it should, that it's not deformed in any way. And I'm looking at primers and primer pockets. And okay, is the primer installed correctly? Is it there? Have you seen a round where a primer had just fallen out? I have. Okay, so those things can happen. So, I'm inspecting those rounds, but even if you do all of that, you're maintaining your gun properly, you're using a gun with a known reputation for reliability, and you're inspecting your ammunition that you're shooting, you can still have a bad round, which is still going to create a malfunction. It doesn't even have to be the round fails to ignite type malfunction where you just get a click instead of a bang. Okay, it can actually be where that round is underpowered for whatever reason, whether it wasn't loaded with enough powder to begin with, maybe the powder was compromised in some way, maybe it got wet or something like that. Your ammunition was stored in too much humidity, who knows? And you go to fire the round, and it does in fact fire, but it doesn't produce enough recoil energy to move your slide fully to the rear. And you can get a failure to eject malfunction, or any number of things when you don't have enough power in that round, because most of us are using semi-automatic guns for our defensive guns, and those are dependent upon the ammunition to generate recoil energy for them to cycle. So,
And if you don't, so say you have a catastrophic failure and your gun goes down completely, this is why you need to learn jujitsu, right? Or to
yeah.
learn how to throw your gun pretty hard and accurately, I would say.
Right. No, you're not wrong. I mean, yeah, we want other skills besides gun skills, and oftentimes those skills will be relevant before the gun comes into play.
Well, that was good. You were talking about, how you might have an underpowered load, and that might lead to like a squib, and that's not something that you're going to fix on the spot, right? So, I mean, that would be end of the world type of a situation. That would be pretty catastrophic if you're not paying close attention to your ammo. You have a squib go off, then I mean that would be pretty rare and pretty unlikely, but that would be a bad day all around for everyone, I think. So
Yeah, you could absolutely have a squib. Let's address that really quickly. For those that don't know what a squib is, that is a low-powered or underpowered round. Um, Typically, a squib, the way it would work is you would fire it, and you won't hear a full report, meaning you won't hear a full bang like you normally do. You might just hear sort of a pop, and
the
maybe
the,
even
re-
kind of like,
the recoil feels
oh, go
weird
ahead.
too. I notice, right? Like on a squib, it feels
Mhm.
like the recoil feel a little mushy and weird. Like you'll feel it and you'll go like, "What was that?" That's what I've noticed.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's so a squib would be the round. There's something wrong with the round, and you fire it. You don't get the full recoil. You don't get a full bang. And what happens is the round is expelled from the cartridge case and gets stuck in the chamber or in the barrel somewhere. And so those are the worst kinds of malfunctions because uh, in a training environment, I've been fortunate enough to catch actual true squibs, training, or I should say competition shooting. I've seen squibs personally. I've had one happen to me personally, actual bullet lodged in barrel. Actually happened to me in the law enforcement training academy years ago, on a shooting test, no less. But it ended up working out okay. Um, I've had it happen a couple of times in courses I was training that I was teaching, maybe twice. That sounds about right. And I've seen squibs on a range as either a participant in a class or seen it as a competitive shooter, as a spectator, meaning that I'm not the one actually shooting at the stage at that point. I've seen it probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 times. So over the course of my career, I've seen like maybe half dozen squibs. And in those environments, it's fortunate when you realize what happened and you can stop yourself and then inspect the gun. And in my case, I just disassembled the gun and pulled the barrel out, and then looked down the barrel and saw, yeah, barrel is obstructed. Okay, that's a problem, right? Um, the unfortunate thing would be if you didn't catch that, which is less likely to occur in a self-defense situation, nor would it really matter. You would then try to fix the malfunction, chamber another round, fire it, and probably cause a kaboom. Because the bullet having nowhere to go, since there's one already stuck in the barrel, could cause an overpressure situation and cause things to kind of explode. I have seen, I had not personally seen it, but I've heard or seen images of people that had squibs and proceeded to fire another round, and it managed to either expel both rounds or not expel any of the rounds, but not quite like fully detonate the gun, just sort of like bullets the barrel and things like that.
I've seen
Anyway,
pictures of rounds stacked up on top of each other inside of the barrel. You've seen that?
yeah, I have too. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know how one does that because that's a little extreme. Like, are we not paying attention here or what? But
Yeah.
the point is, if you ever fire around and it sounds weird, the recoil is weird. Um, maybe you even don't see the bullet hole on the paper or whatever that you're shooting at. Uh, it's a good idea to stop and take a look at the gun. Be safe. Okay, don't try to run another round through it when you could possibly have a squib. So you want to be aware and watch for those kinds of things. And there isn't a whole lot, like you said, that we can do about that in terms of like malfunction clearing. Because we're talking about immediate action drills right now, meaning something with the gun fails to function like it should. What are the things that we need to immediately do to get it back to working again? Because we're concerned about a self defense situation. All right. So that's the type of malfunction we're here to talk about today. Before we get into talking about the clearing of them, let's talk a little bit more, Brian, about. I mean, I've sort of dropped some hints, maybe you have as well, about this, but let's talk a little more about the idea of preventing malfunctions. So, and probably we should identify maybe what some of the malfunctions are for those that may not know. But let's just first talk about like what's prevention look like.
I think prevention primarily will start with the user itself. Now, this is me from the philosophy of how I've understood malfunctions is that first we want to make sure that our gear is operational. So we want to make sure it's well maintained, well lubricated and cleaned and functional, so that we're going out. We don't want to be those bubbas in the back of the van, in those CIA movies, checking their guns, right before they walk in, right? We want to make sure that that's all done ahead of time and that all of our gear is primo and ready to go, so that we don't have any of those types of malfunctions. And then also we want to make sure that our movements for weapon manipulation are precise as we can be in the situation. So we want to make sure that we're getting a good grip on the gun, we're getting a good clean draw, clearing our cover garments and those types of things to get them out of the way of the function of the weapon, and trying to reduce as much end user error as we can. And I think that's probably where we would start.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a couple of key things already, and the first one that jumped out to me was that our firearms are properly lubricated. So I can't say for sure whether every class I've taught as an instructor has had a student's gun malfunction, um, but I would say that pretty much every class at some point has a malfunction occur at some point. Uh, Understand that in a class that might be 8 to 12 students on average for the type of classes that I'm teaching over the course of 2 days, everyone's shooting about 700 rounds. So when you're talking about, I don't know, 6 to 8,000 rounds or something being expended over the course of 2 days, it's a lot of opportunities for things to not work right. And so we typically will see one or two issues over the course of the weekend. It's usually from the same once we see one, then if there's more, it's usually from the same person or same gun. uh, the number one thing are guns that are dry, meaning not lubricated enough. Not even so much that they're dirty, although dirty guns can be a malfunction issue. It's not usually how dirty the gun is, it's usually how dry or not lubricated it is. That is like the number one cause of malfunctions. And I have to even like check myself because one of the challenges is you're carrying on a daily basis. And, it's easy to get in a routine where, you I put on my gun for the day. I go about my daily activities, carrying that gun. I come home at night, put it away, and then rinse and repeat, do the same thing day in, day out, day in, day out. And then before you know it, the gun that was formerly clean, well lubricated, mo- your lubricants are typically going to have some amount of evaporation over time. They're going to dry out. All right. There's a few lubricants that do better than others in this regard, but still, over time, things are going to probably dry out and or collect things like dust or lint in that lubrication that could create problems as well because you're carrying that gun up against your body. And day in and day out, it's going to collect some amount of debris, dust or otherwise. And so, just like recently, I was looking at my daily carry gun, which these days has been an HK VP9SK, so the subcompact VP9. Really, really like it. Carry it with a 15 round magazine, and it's a great combination for everyday carry gun. But I wasn't shooting it a whole lot. I was, if I went to the range, I'd shoot it occasionally, but I was mostly shooting my full size VP9. And so recently I was looking at my VP9SK and noticing, oh, wow, this thing's, a little bit dirty. Dirty meaning like collecting dust and lint and not looking so hot. And so had to do a little bit of, maintenance on it recently. Um, Lubrication is key to guns operating optimally. And so please do not overlook that. That is, again, that's like the number one thing. A student has problems with a gun, and the first thing I look for is how dry is this thing? And I'll either have them do it or I'll ask if I can take a look at their gun and unload it and just work the slide a couple times. And I can feel it a lot of times as I work the slide. It's like, instead of you just feel it, just dragging and grinding, as you work the slide. It's like, okay, this is probably your issue. And 9 times out of 10, we add some lubricant to the gun and it's back up and running, no issue.
Yeah, I've known a few.
Not even having to clean it, just adding lubricant.
I've known a few instructors that walk around with some gun oil on their person, and then as soon as a student starts to have problems, they break the gun down, lube it up, and hand it back, and they usually do much better after that.
Hmm. Yep. And the second common thing is, as we've sort of touched on, is user induced. So poor grip, inconsistent draw, things of that nature. Your gun cycles because you fire around and it has something to push against, meaning your hand on the grip, to allow that slide to move to the rear fully and fully extract a case and then pick up the next one and shove it back in. If your hand or wrist is experiencing too much movement and not enough resistance to that recoil energy, then there's a much higher probability you're going to have a malfunction. That's oftentimes where uh, what's known as a stovepipe commonly, or a failure to eject malfunction, commonly occurs because of a poor grip, meaning not even so much grip, it can be grip, but a poor, you're not resisting the gun enough, meaning you're not anchoring things in your hand enough, or the wrist is allowing things to rotate too easily, which is referred to as limp wristing the gun. You're going to create malfunctions that way for sure.
Poor grip posturing or something like that, right? Yeah, poor grip posture, as if they're not
Mhm.
gripping it properly and they don't have enough rigidity behind their wrist that they will induce a malfunction.
Yep. Maybe you're gripping the gun too low on the grip. You're not getting a good high grip, not getting the web of your hand into the beaver tail of the gun. Gripping lower is going to allow that gun also to not have as much recoil resistance. Yeah, like Brian's showing here on the screen. If you're gripping it down low like he's got there, it's going to flip in the hand a lot easier. And that could create a malfunction problem too. So these are the kinds of things that are commonly user induced. And again, like some of you are probably like, well, I don't have a problem with that because I practice a lot. I do my daily dry fire and those kinds of things. But I will tell you that I've seen people do funky things when they're under stress, because I mean, even from a high level, high skilled shooter that I've had in a class before, when as soon as I started putting the pressure on them, like encouraging them, hey, you can do this faster because I'm pushing them on a particular drill. Well, all of a sudden they start missing their grip on their draw, you know, and that's the whole point of pushing them a little bit is like, look, like if you're not growing if you're not pushing yourself to a point of failure or near failure because you're, that's where the growth occurs is when you make things hard, you know? And so these are good things to discover and to realize and recognize about yourself. It's good to push yourself in training and practice as long as you're being safe so that you discover where your failure points are. So you discover, oh, I do just fine when I, do such and such drill at this pace. But as soon as I strive for pushing for, that next level, now all of a sudden I'm missing my grip on the draw and things of that nature. And so then you can start looking at, well, what can I do to help ensure I don't miss my grip? So
I think one of the important things is if you're going to be drawing your weapon in a compromised situation or up close and you're having to shoot from like a weird situation or, and that kind of thing, even if you are the most accomplished shooter that's on the planet, there's still a chance that you could induce a malfunction and then you would need to clear that. So everybody needs to learn it. I think there's no doubt about it. And what would you say are the most common forms of malfunctions that you've seen?
so I'd say there's probably three common malfunctions that I've seen. If it's ammunition related, it's a it's a failure to fire. Okay, so meaning you get a click instead of a bang, right? And how do you solve that? Tap rack. Um,
Now,
the
wait,
next common thing would. Oh, go ahead.
real quick. Now you said tap rack, and
Yeah.
now I've also heard it said tap rack and bang. Right? Have you heard
Yeah.
it called that before? Tap rack and bang is the way that you clear that.
Yeah. So the idea, I mean, well, bang is what? Bang is firing the gun again.
Right.
The bang is not part of fixing the malfunction. There might be a bang, there might not be a bang that follows the actual clearing malfunction. The thing that clears the malfunction is probably just the rack, actually. You might not even need the tap, but it's probably a good idea to still do the tap in most contexts. And so what clears the malfunction is tap rack. The
That
reason
that
why the tap might be important is the second most common malfunction I've seen, which could also be I guess it would be a user operator type error, is failing to get the gun loaded properly. Now it's either failing to, like, you think it's loaded and it's not because you failed to chamber around, or you failed to seat the magazine fully and therefore failed to chamber around. And so that's probably the next big thing. And I've seen that quite a few times. It's even happened to me. In fact, I had a stage, I think Area 2 championship a couple years ago where we started with, it was an unloaded start. And the gun started on a barrel and your magazines that you're loading with had to start on the barrel as well. And what I do nowadays is if I'm starting with an unloaded start, I I download my magazine that I'm loading with by one round because it's easier to seat. And what happened was under stress, I picked up my magazine, I picked up my gun, I put the magazine in, I racked the slide, and because I had those magazines stuffed to the hilt, maximum capacity, and it was really, 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 there's a lot of spring pressure in that magazine. I didn't get it fully seated. Magazine in, racked slide, went to shoot my first target, and I got a click instead of a bang. And I wouldn't have realized initially what was going on, except for that my magazine just fell out of the gun at that point. Like the click was just enough to dislodge the magazine. So I pressed the trigger and it got click, and that vibration was enough for that mag just to fall out of the gun. And I remember kind of like seeing it fall out and being like, oh crap, and then grabbing it and having to start over again. Um, but I've seen that in classes quite a few times too. And here's the other thing. So under stress, we talk about the challenges of getting a good grip on the gun. And one of the big challenges I've seen from some people is their support hand. So we're not just talking about like the primary hand not getting high enough on the gun or whatever, but the support hand being on the gun in a maybe different place than what it usually is. And the support hand can push the mag release if you're not careful on, especially on certain guns. Some guns, depending on where the mag release is, it's going to depend on your hand and hand shape and size and exactly where your hand ends up on that gun. But your support hand, if it's not where it's supposed to be, might inadvertently hit that mag release and cause the magazine to come loose. And it might just totally fall out. That's one thing. But I've seen it where the magazine stays in the gun, but it's not all the way in. And so then you could rack the slide as many times as you want, and it's not going to pick up a round, right? And so you're going to get click after click after click. And so because those kinds of things can and do happen, it's probably a good idea to make sure that when we're clearing such things, to tap the magazine to make sure it's fully seated and rack the slide to get a round in the chamber, whether that's to eject a bad round that failed to fire or to get a round in the chamber because you failed to get one in the first place.
I
And
know
so,
one of the things that you would see in the military pretty often is something very similar to that. The first couple of guys that would get online with their rifles when they were learning to shoot, they'd be very careful to keep their finger straightened off the trigger, but they would let it rest right there on the magazine release, that nice little button. And so they would be
mhm,
all nervous and getting ready, and then they would have the command to come up to shoot, and they nervous and they pop that button, and their magazine would fall out, and they'd look so dumb. And everybody would make fun of
yep,
them, of course. But yeah, that's a operator induced error. That's something that could
yep,
definitely happen, and we don't want that happening in a gunfight.
yeah. I've seen that happen as well on ARs, which is why it's a good idea to allow that index finger, trigger finger, to rest above that mag release and not on it. So yeah, very good point. Now, the third most common type of malfunction I've seen is some kind of failure to eject, typically, and that again is usually because the slide is not cycling fully, and that is either user induced because they have a poor grip on the gun, or it can be ammunition related to where the ammunition itself is not powered strongly enough to get that full slide cycle. And so those are probably the three big ones. And that is typically solved with a tap rack as well, of addressing the malfunction problem. But so yeah, those are probably the three most common things that I've seen: either bad ammunition, failure to get ammunition in the gun, either because we failed to chamber it in the first place or failed to get the magazine in, or something about our grip causes the magazine to come loose. And then the third thing being that failure to eject or stovepipe type malfunction because of poor grip or underpowered ammo.
And that's okay. So we've got the three; those are the three main types. And so those are the ones
Not
that you would
necessarily
like.
types of malfunction. Just to be clear, not the three main types of malfunctions, but the three main types that I've seen. So I just
What
want to
would
make
you?
sure that we're clear that we're not talking about, because there's really like kind of three categories of malfunctions, and we haven't addressed everything there. I just want to make sure there's not confusion.
Okay, so there's a difference between categories and the types.
You asked me what I've seen, and that's what I answered.
I
But we
see.
haven't actually we haven't talked about the official types of malfunctions.
All right. Well,
Like
let's
people
do
talk
that
about
then.
type 1, type 2, type 3, and so on.
Okay. Well, let's do that. So if somebody's new and getting into this, what are they talking about when someone discusses malfunctions that way?
Yeah. And I kind of I've shied away a little bit from using the type 1, type 2, type 3 classification because I don't know. I don't even know who came up with those, to be honest with you. And it can be somewhat confusing to some folks. I think it's more important to call malfunctions what they are, and that I think probably jives with most people. And then it's like, okay, this is this type of malfunction, and I know what I need to do to fix that. So, what are the three types of malfunctions, and we've basically addressed two of those already. One where we fail to get a bang, okay? And it's diagnosed with typically a click instead of a bang. So we press the trigger, instead of hearing bang and seeing the gunfire, we just get a click, like an actual click, because the firing pin is released, but the gun doesn't go bang. All right, that's what you call a type 1 malfunction, a failure to fire malfunction. And a failure to fire occurs because either the round itself is bad for whatever reason, or you don't have ammunition in the chamber to begin with, which we've kind of addressed, what might lead to that, right? Failing to load the gun in the first place, failing to get the magazine fully seated, etc. So a failure to fire malfunction is the first type. All right. The second type is a failure to eject malfunction. And that's where the gun fired, but we have an empty case that didn't get fully ejected from the gun. So the case itself, the empty case, is lodged in the action of the gun somewhere. All right. And that's what a lot of people refer to as a stovepipe. The classic stovepipe, it got that name from 1911s, which were known for creating that type of malfunction, as far as that true stovepipe where the case is sort of like stuck pointing upward in the action of the gun. But in today's world, with our more modern semi-automatics, what's more commonly seen with failure to eject malfunctions is I usually see the case lodged in there diagonally inside the ejection port, not necessarily like sticking straight out. It can be sticking straight out like a stovepipe, but it isn't necessarily. So a lot of times it's part way coming out of the chamber and it's diagonal stuck in the action. That's a failure to eject malfunction. It's usually caused by, again, it could be a poor grip. It could be that the ammunition is underpowered. It could be that the combination of the ammunition, maybe the ammunition itself is not technically out of spec, but maybe it's on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of recoil, and your particular gun has a really stiff recoil spring. And that's what we call a mismatch or bad tuning of ammunition and gun, meaning the gun and ammunition are not a good match for one another. The gun the gun's oversprung and requires more of a full power load, but you're shooting competition loads, let's say. That's a very common thing. Guys will get into competition shooting and they'll be using a stock gun, which often comes from the factory with heavier than needed recoil springs, because they're trying to build those guns to be optimized for reliability, assuming the user's using full power loads. They want to ensure that slide is going to get around, pushed into the chamber fully and get back fully into battery. And so they'll send them out with really strong recoil springs. But a competition user typically is going to need to use a reduced power recoil spring if they're going to use competition loads. Anyway, point of that is the gun doesn't fully cycle. That's going to create a failure to eject, and that's usually solved with a tap rack, just like a failure to fire. The diagnosis of a failure to eject, by the way, is usually going to be a dead trigger, meaning the trigger's no longer, like, it might just be spongy. It might be stuck to the rear in the case of like a Glock. But chances are you're not getting a click of any kind. You're just getting a trigger that does nothing. Okay, that's typically the diagnosis. And at that point, the user could actually turn the gun, the ejection port towards them to see, hey, what's going on here, and see that they have a stuck case, okay, in the action. And that would be the diagnosis. And then the third type is what we typically call a failure to extract malfunction, sometimes also known as a double feed malfunction, although a double feed is not necessarily the same thing as a failure to extract. It can be in a few limited cases, but not always. A failure to extract means it usually means the gun went bang and the empty case, the fired case, is still stuck in the chamber, but the gun has cycled either fully or partially. This could be a failure of the extractor itself, where the extractor failed to hold on to the rim of the case to pull it out of the chamber because maybe the extractor is damaged or worn. It could be the extractor spring that is responsible for keeping pressure on that extractor is tired. That spring is worn out. It could be, in a few limited cases, where that round was overpressured somewhat, and it caused that case to expand so tightly in the chamber that it's just too much friction for the extractor to pull it out of the gun, and the extractor just ended up slipping off the rim. That can happen. And it could be the chamber is really dirty or corroded, and that could add to or create those kind of situations as well, where the case just is not, there's just too much friction with extracting it from the chamber. So that would be some common reasons why a failure to extract might occur. The classic double feed malfunction doesn't exist as commonly as what people think in semi-automatic pistols. It can happen, but really what we see a lot of times, if there's a stuck case in the chamber, what sometimes happens is the user will run the slide, they'll rack the slide in an effort to clear the gun without realizing that there's a round or a case stuck in the chamber, and then they'll end up picking up the next round and pushing that into the rear of the stuck case. And then at that point, they're like, oh, I have a double feed. And a lot of times those double feeds that we see in pistols are user created or user induced, and not necessarily how the gun created it. Not that it really matters, because a lot of times we have to do the same thing to solve the malfunction in the first place. Meaning, if we have a stuck case in the chamber, that a simple tap rack won't fix it, because chances are, if I tap rack, I'm just going to push another round into the back of the stuck case. Okay. It also may not fix it because maybe the extractor itself has failed me in some way. And so I could tap rack it all I want, and it's maybe not going to pull that case out. Hopefully it would, but it's not a guarantee. So, but what we typically do to clear a type 3 malfunction or a failure to extract malfunction is we need to get the source of the ammunition, the magazine, out of the gun, because we can't run the slide multiple times without trying to push around into a not empty chamber. And so we got to get the magazine out of the gun, and then we got to run the slide several times. Typically 3 times is the standard, but the reality is I got to run that slide as many times as I need to in the case of an extractor failure until that case comes out. So it could be 3 times, it could be 10, or whatever I need, until hopefully something happens. But oftentimes 3 times we'll get that malfunction cleared out of the gun, and then we need to get the gun reloaded, meaning magazine back in the gun, chamber around. So the traditional clearing procedure is lock the slide to the rear, pull the magazine out, rack the slide 3 times, put the magazine back in, rack the slide 1 more time to get a fresh round in the chamber. So that's kind of the standard clearing procedure. You don't necessarily always have to lock the slide to the rear first. It kind of depends on the gun. Some guns respond better to locking the slide to the rear first. Some don't require that. And so oftentimes I would say with today's modern semi-automatics, it's not really a requirement. Glocks, I can just rip the magazine out of the gun without locking the slide. SIGs, I can definitely do that with. The HKs, I can do that with. So if I have a failure to extract, I don't bother with locking the slide to the rear. I just strip the magazine out of the gun and then rack the slide several times, put the magazine back in and rack it. So I think probably in a future episode, we'll introduce you all to a simplified approach to clearing malfunctions like these that we've talked about here today. And maybe not necessarily simplified in the fact that my goal is to reduce cognitive load on people when they're under stress. And the diagnosis for something like a failure to extract is going to be very similar to a failure to eject. And they can feel like the same thing. And they can even look like the same thing if you don't know what you're looking for, or you don't really pay attention in the moment. And again, as I mentioned, you can take a stuck case situation and make it into a double feed if you don't know what you're doing. And so, not that again is the end of the world, because you probably need to go through the same procedures to solve the problem anyway. But um, so probably in a future episode, we'll talk about and introduce a simplified mental approach to diagnosing and fixing malfunctions. But today we've basically talked about the three main types and kind of the classic way of solving them, either a tap rack or, you know, magazine out, rack, magazine in, reload kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and we went over today. I thought some of the interesting things that you talked about was one, malfunctions can happen to anyone. Doesn't matter how trained that you are, but it's more likely to happen to you if you're a new shooter, and especially it's going to happen to you, more likely to happen to you in a defensive situation, given your compromised settings and shooting positions and such, and
Yeah.
that there are a variety of different malfunctions that can occur. Many of those from either the weapon itself, the ammunition, or the shooter, and how we can address those and prepare for those ahead of time and be better defensive shooters.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, like you just mentioned something. I don't even know if you meant to or not, but you mentioned that we might be shooting in compromised positions.
Hmm.
And that's another factor that is important to recognize, that some people maybe don't think about, that hey, I don't deal with problems with my gun. I don't have malfunctions. I'm not worried about that so much. But understand that you might be shooting in a, and it's not even an entanglement situation, but you might just be shooting in a somewhat compromised position or off balance, or that kind of thing. And that can, again, this is why we don't get to choose the time and the day and the location for our gunfight. We just have to deal with the circumstances that we are given, and those circumstances are often not ideal. And as you talked about earlier in the kind of beginning part of the episode, Brian, Private Murphy, or as people not in the military would be familiar with, Murphy's Law. Old Murphy shows up, when we least expect it. And I don't know how you explain that. I mean, it sure seems like it's a law, because I've had enough things happen in my life that it's like, yeah, there's something about that when you least expect it, and the crap hits the fan, and now crap gets even worse because old Murphy shows up when you're not even looking for him. You can plan the best, you can be the most thorough in your preparation, and still old Murphy can show up. So
The best laid plans, right? Like, if
yep.
it can go wrong, it will. You might have to be stacking bodies on your back, upside down in the dirt, up against a tire, and you don't have time for that kind of stuff, right? So you got to be able to think on the fly, clear those malfunctions, get that job done.
That's right. That's right. Good thoughts. Well, we're basically at about an hour for this episode today, and so as we've alluded to, I think we'll have at least another follow-up episode to this topic to address some other considerations with respect to malfunctions. And we've been mostly focused on talking about pistol malfunctions today. We could also talk about, malfunctions in a rifle, in an AR carbine, or that kind of thing. But I definitely think that it's worthwhile in a future episode to provide the listeners with a simplified approach. And I'll also just tease, as I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, you guys want to make sure you're on our email newsletter by going to concealedcarry.com/newsletter to make sure you get our emails we're going to be sending next week to our whole list. And especially on September 12th, we're going to be making a huge announcement that you're going to want to be a part of. And just to tease a little bit of that, we've filmed some video content to address a lot of things we're talking about today, and to address some of the things that we're going to talk about in a future episode. And I even show and talk about this simplified approach to solving malfunctions that I think is going to be worthwhile for folks to check out. The point to all of this is we want you to be the most prepared that you can be. We want you to have the tools, the resources, the know-how, the skills to be effective self-defenders, concealed carriers. Okay. And sometimes things don't go the way we want them to go. And they especially seem to not go super smoothly when conditions are not ideal. And so this kind of stuff is important, and it's more common than you realize, especially when stress is high and people start doing things they don't expect, or you're in the situation or circumstance or environment that you weren't expecting or planning for. So knowing how to deal with malfunctions is a relevant and an important skill. And we encourage you to learn more and to study that and to get some training and practice with that. This will be some great content coming up soon to help you in your journey with that as well. But for today, I think we got to wrap this one up.
Absolutely. I always lately I've been trying to end each one of the podcasts with a quote that I think fits the topic, and this one is from Gunny R. Lee Ermey, and the quote is, "What is your major malfunction?" There you
Nice. Well, folks, a reminder of today's episode sponsors are Ready Up Gear Dummy Rounds. You can check those out at concealedcarry.com/dummy rounds. Also, in a future episode, we can talk a little bit more about using those and how you might use those effectively. And also the Type 3 malfunction round, which you can find at concealedcarry.com/T3MR. We appreciate all of you for being a part of this episode with us here today. Again, I've been gone for a bit. I really appreciate you guys' support. I've even got a couple of messages from a few folks asking just to make sure I was okay. I've been absolutely okay. Just taking some time away and refocusing on some things at home and with my family. I appreciate you all very much. I want you to know that. And I appreciate Brian and I appreciate Jacob for all they do and for providing some cover for me while I've been away. And so with that, we're going to wrap this up and let you go. So until next time, a reminder to train right, train often, and train safe so you can fight hard, fight fast, and fight true. Take care.